Hi everyone, I'm coming at you from in the middle of nature because I'm on a kind of a vacation here, but which is also why I'm not posting as many videos as usual right now. But that doesn't mean I can't give you a Q&A. I hope the sound works because there's a lot of wind right now, so we'll see how it goes. This time I will only be answering questions posed by my Patreon community, because I got a lot of questions from my patrons, and that's going to take up all of this video basically. Again, if you want to become a patron yourself, I will leave a link to all of that stuff in the description. So yeah, let's start answering some questions. Question number one, by Stephen Phillips on Patreon. There are scholars who raise questions about the traditional narrative about Muhammad's life in Mecca, the Hijrah, and the revelation of the Quran. Some suggest that the Quran was compiled by a group of authors in Syria. What do you know about this scholarship, and do you think it is well founded? It seems to become more and more popular, these sort of revisionist ideas about the early days of Islam, considering Muhammad may have been. So there are theories that Mecca is not actually Mecca, but that the original Mecca was in Petra, and they base this on certain descriptions of Mecca in the Quran that doesn't seem to match up with the environments in Mecca itself, talking about trees and nature that doesn't exist there, etc. I think I've answered this question in a live Q&A once. I think it's an interesting theory. I think all theories are welcome. I am not convinced by this theory yet. I think there isn't enough solid evidence, I think, to make that claim, but I do think that it is definitely a legitimate thing to do more research in. I think I support the scholars to do that stuff. I think because any scholarship is welcome, of course, even if it does raise some serious questions about our common knowledge about a topic like that. Alex M. asked the question, how much do you think Islam and Christianity, and Judaism for that matter, counter-influence each other? We see Aquinas citing Muslim theologians, citing Islamic scholars in his writings, and people like Maimonides. How much do you think that plays into the evolution of dogma in each religion? A lot, of course. Religions are always influencing each other, they're commingling, especially in a place like the Middle East, for example. In the Middle Ages, there were Muslims, there were Christians, there were Jews, there were people of other religions, of course, and they all influence each other. There's no denying that. We talk a lot about Sufism on this channel. Many scholars today believe that the early Sufi ascetics were influenced by the Christian monastics in the Middle East at that time. We see a lot of influence in Islamic philosophy, or in the Islamic philosophers from Neoplatonism, which was originally a pagan it was a philosophy that emerged in a pagan environment. And the whole enterprise of Kalam, of doctrinal philosophical theology within Islam, with the groups like the Ash'arites and Mu'tazila and so on. Historians argue that that whole tradition of Kalam emerged originally as a result of the Christians and their very sophisticated debates and discussions on theological matters in the Middle East, and that the Muslims developed this tradition of Kalam as a way to respond to that and to be able to counter the philosophical and theological arguments by the Christians. And then later on in the Middle Ages, you see the opposite happening, of course. The Islamic philosophers and the philosophers in the Islamic world generally are hugely influential. They develop the Greek philosophy and develop new philosophies, which becomes incredibly fruitful and important. And this then travels to Europe, and this influence, as you said, influences Christian theologians and philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, like, Meister Eckhart. And again, the same goes for Jewish philosophers. Maimonides and other Jewish philosophers within the Islamic world are influenced by Islamic thinkers, and the Islamic thinkers are influenced by the Jewish thinkers. So this is always happening. Like religions are influencing each other, philosophies are influencing each other. None of these religions would be where they are and would have the history that they have if they hadn't come into contact with all these other traditions. So the influence is huge, I would say. Farah asks, hi, what is your earliest memory of a religious thought? Reflecting on some religious teaching as an adult shared with you, or wondering about the existence and a creator as a child. Do you believe in such a thing as an innate sense of religiosity? I can't remember. I think, well, as every child, or most children, I guess, I would lay awake at night thinking about death and things like that, like the idea of nothingness, whether or not death meant absolute nothingness, absolute annihilation. That was a thing. And then the classic question of, I remember having this thought as like an 11-year-old, or maybe earlier, maybe like 8 years old. I was lying awake at night thinking about colors. So this very, very common philosophical question that I think everyone has at some point, which is like, well, I see, so does my green look the same to you? Like, or if there are two people, do they see the color green in the same way, or the color yellow, etc., or are those colors somehow different for different people? Like, so I remember having that thought. I think I always had a sense that there was something more to the argument than what was presented by a lot of my atheist companions or family members or whatever. I always seem to be drawn to a more subtle and complex view of the world, where the idea of a divinity beyond the physical or material world was always attractive to me, I guess. And I remember having debates in high school with people, like both atheists and theists. We would have like discussions, and I would take some sort of middle position. I was also probably influenced by listening a lot to the Beatles and to sort of the 60s kind of counterculture movement and all the spiritual aspects of that, I think did influence me as a teenager, etc. I don't know. So I don't think it's much of a moment necessarily where I had a profound spiritual or religious thought. It's been more of a sort of gradual development and change over time, even as a child, I would say. Farah also asked, are you familiar with integral theory or spiral dynamics? If yes, what do you think of the stages of them? I actually don't. I haven't heard of that, I think, so I should check that out. Thank you for suggesting it. It sounds interesting. I'll look it up. Okay, so Rob Domos asked a question a while ago. I forgot to answer it in the previous Q&A, and I apologize for that. The question basically is, he's commenting on the fact that a lot of sacred scriptures or important scriptures in different religions seem to appear around the year 500 BC or BCE. And basically, like, why is that? Why do you think that so many scriptures appear around that time? And I guess that's true to some degree. A lot of sections from the Bible seem to have been written around that time, 500-ish BC. This is the time of the Babylonian exile. You also have the Upanishads, which is by scholars considered to have appeared at around that time, at least certain sections of the Upanishads. You have the Tao Te Ching, which seems to have been written around that time, or a bit later. You have the Zhuangzi in China. You have the Bhagavad Gita, which appears, we don't know exactly, but from maybe 300 BC to a century to CE or AD. What else? There's a lot of so you can't deny that there's a lot of scriptures that appear around that time. I don't know if I agree with the starting assumption to any huge degree. I think there are always scriptures appearing in different times. So you can look at, the Sikh scriptures, the Guru Granth Sahib, that appears in the 16th century, right? Or at least it's compiled at around that time. The Bible or the New Testament appears later on. The Quran comes in the 600s AD. At the same time, there definitely is a lot of stuff happening at around that time. In Greece, you have the appearance of philosophy basically at around that time. The pre-Socratics. You have Pythagoras and Parmenides and all these people. So there's something happening. The Buddha also, and Jainism appears at around this time. I think it may have something to do with writing. There's a lot more writing down of things at around that time. The Bible is being written down, whereas previously it might have been an oral thing. The Upanishads also, which is still really mostly an oral thing. And I'm not an expert on this particular subject, but I believe that it is around this time that things start to be written down. The philosophers in Greece, they also would actually write, at least, Plato and Aristotle, they would write things. And the same goes for China. I don't know if there's a connection between all of these. In that sense, it may be a coincidence that it all appears at around this time, but I think it may have something to do with writing and the development of writing and the way that writing is used, the way that writing is employed, and is being seen as a more legitimate way of teaching religious or philosophical thought as opposed to orally, which was for most of history really has been the way that things are taught. So teacher, student, oral teaching. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it is around this time that we start to see writing being employed a lot more. So I think that might be, this is a sort of wild but I guess a bit educated guess, is that it has something to do with writing and the fact that writing preserves things in a very different way than simply oral teaching. That would be my guess, that if anything, if there's any connection here, I would say it has something to do with that. So Ralph Nissel asks, all religions in some way discuss meaning of life. And what is, you would say, the lowest common denominator between the religions? It's really hard to say because religion is such a... Religion as a concept is a construct like any other religion, like any other concept like that. It's a Western word that's applied to a lot of different things that don't necessarily connect to each other. A lot of people, a common way to define religion, at least in a sort of Protestant European environment, is to say that it has something to do with belief, like belief in a god. But then, like, what do you do with Buddhism, which isn't I think a common misunderstanding is that it's atheist. It's not atheist, but it doesn't require the belief in a god, so that's not a central aspect of what that is. But should we then consider Buddhism to not be a religion? I wouldn't say so. So religion, I think, is a very complex term, and I think it's hard to talk about something that connects all of them. To me, religion is primarily something about, like, follows a Durkheimian sociological perspective on religion, where what makes a religion and what the basic human function of religion is, primarily I would say, is social, that it has to do with social cohesion and informing groups and of belonging, sort of identity formation and to belong into a certain group, sort of forming these in-groups and out-groups and so on. I think that's what religion primarily is about, a sense of belonging to something. So maybe that's my answer to that, is that it's something that gives someone a sense of identity and a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves, I guess, or to a sort of a group or a more abstract structure, I would say. Ralph again asked, do you think the religions give better answers than others as philosophers, scientists, regarding the why question in meaning of life discussions? That is, why is there any meaning at all for us humans to live on? What's the higher purpose of our lives? Well, science don't seem to be interested in those kinds of questions, mostly. That isn't to say that scientists aren't interested in that, but science is a method, right? So it talks about the how of things. It can map at least the modern understanding of the word science. If we talk about science a few hundred years ago, there would be a different idea of what science is, which would include things like metaphysics, perhaps. But as it stands right now, I think science is most interested in mapping the physical and material world, how things work, and why they work as they work, but not necessarily the sort of grand why question. And so your question is, does religion give a better answer to that? And it at least tries to, sometimes. But there are, of course, as you know, so many religions and so many philosophies that they sort of cancel each other out sometimes, I would say. You could argue that you can find common ideas and common themes within different philosophies and religions that might appear to be somehow universally true, etc. But in general, religions are so diverse that I wouldn't go as far as to say that it gives a better answer. But I will give it that it tries to give us the answer. It attempts to talk about those questions. It talks about metaphysical questions. It asks, okay, well, this is how the universe began, but why did it begin? And I don't know, maybe there doesn't need to be a why, but I think religion sometimes, at least, or a lot of the time, they are occupied with trying to answer those questions. Third question from Ralph. I have the recent period started to use the expression spirit of the universe instead of God. Do you also think it can be useful when discussing and comparing religions and spirituality? Sometimes, yes, sometimes not. I think spirit of the universe implies a kind of monistic, or not necessarily monistic, but a kind of pantheistic, immanentist view of what God is. So if we talk about Advaita Vedanta, or we talk about Taoism, so we talk about the Tao in Taoism, or we talk about God as understood by certain mystics in the different monotheistic religions, for example, then spirit of the universe wouldn't be entirely wrong to say, even in something like Sufism, which is comes from a monotheistic environment. God is sometimes described, I think it was Abdul Karim Al-Jili, who describes God as the soul of my soul, which is kind of nice, kind of a similar idea. But if we consider other expressions of religion, which isn't as focused on an immanentist view of God, but instead of God as transcendent, as being different from creation, the sort of classic standard understanding of monotheism, then spirit of the universe wouldn't fit all too well. So I wouldn't apply a term like that to all religion or to God as a general concept, but maybe to certain understandings of God. Sure. Yahya Bashandi asked, were there any Muslim converts to Christianity or Judaism or any other religion? Was it common? How did the authorities deal with it? How did the local clerics respond to it? And what was the treatment of the converts by the authorities? So did it happen? Yes. There were Muslims there has always been Muslims who have converted to Christianity, to Judaism, etc. Was it common? Well, that depends on the period we're talking about. In some periods it was more common than in other periods. So that's a difficult question to answer. But so what was the treatment of these people? What was the attitude of the clerics? So a commonly known thing, which is often discussed when talking about Islam and in the contemporary world, is the fact that apostates are often given the death sentence within Islam. And that was true early on as well. The idea of someone leaving the religion and instead becoming or joining some other group was seen as a form of treason. So you have to remember that in the early days, especially of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was basically at war, in conflict with other groups in Arabia who were pagans, etc. And if someone left Islam, so to say, and joined the other religion, that was a form of treason. That meant that you joined the other army that were trying to kill you. So many argue that is where that idea comes from, that the idea of an apostate, or the fact that an apostate should face capital punishment for that. And that was the general, I would say, the majority position. I mean, don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure that was the majority opinion of jurists and scholars in the early days of Islam. Now, that doesn't mean that as soon as someone converted to Christianity, they beheaded him. Of course, there was a process, a legal process, and they were often given a lot of opportunity to repent. So the first step would be to ask them to repent. If they refused to repent, they would be placed in prison, and they would be in prison, and the clerics or the authorities would try to pressure them to recant their conversion and come back to Islam. And then if nothing worked, then indeed the capital punishment would be applied. Now that is you could say the ideal of the jurists, right? According to the Sharia or Islamic law, and that was what jurists would declare in fatwas, for example, so legal opinions. Those fatwas were never binding to the authorities, so the authorities could choose to not apply them. They could choose to ignore them, and so there were converts who weren't killed, of course. But in terms of like the general attitude of the scholars or the jurists and how they approached that question, that was a general way that was seen, that if someone left Islam, then that warranted that they be killed, although after a long process of allowing them the ability to repent or recant that conversion. Hrishikesh Diwan asks, you touched on this in one of your videos on Hinduism, but do you think it qualifies as an ism? I was born into a Hindu family and grew up a skeptic, eventually an atheist. The more I learned about Hinduism, the more I realized it was an exonym given to a way of life by colonialist hive mind, and you can't really compare it to, say, Islam, Christianity, because there is no central creed, catechism, or practices that actually make it an ism. I take your point about it being a religion in that it is a set of correlated practices that about 1 billion people follow, but isn't that broad? Is it too broad to be an ism? Hinduism is a complex topic, right? So Hinduism, some people argue that it shouldn't even be seen as a religion, that it really is multiple religions, that is sort of collected under this umbrella term. I won't go that far. As I've stated in my video on the Vedas, I would say that it's definitely an umbrella term of sorts for a collection of religious traditions in India or the Indian subcontinent, but that they are connected enough for us to be able to use a term like a religion for it. Now, ism is a very complex term. I don't like, so usually ism isn't applicable because most religions and most movements that are termed isms are too complex to use that term. Even something like Sufism, like that's. So ism, I don't like isms generally. But Hinduism is a special case because it is such a complex and multifaceted tradition. I've seen many people, so here's the thing, I've seen many people say that Hinduism isn't a religion, it's a way of life. But that's it's a strange position to hold, because which religion is not a way of life? All religions see themselves as a way of life. It's not just about a belief in a god. It's a whole, religions are often a whole system, a social system of how to live your life, how to live alongside other people, etc. So I don't agree with that statement, like the idea that Hinduism is more of a way of life or ways of life in this case, than they are a religion. But I definitely agree with the idea that Hinduism is a tradition that is so complicated that using things like isms or placing it under the category of a religion can become a problem, right? It can become problematic when we consider its huge diversity. Again, this is also, of course, true for most religions. Christianity is hugely diverse. Islam is hugely diverse. There's a whole host of different traditions within all of those terms, even if they are considered unitary religions. But again, like Hinduism is perhaps even more so. Like, it is a hugely diverse tradition. So yeah, I agree with you. I think in some sense, just using the word ism doesn't capture the complexity of Hinduism. I don't know if I would say that we should replace that term, but there is definitely a point in asking questions about whether or not it's an accurate term, and I would say that in some ways it isn't. But yeah, it's a complicated topic. Rick Chatterjee asked, how did Bulleh Shah become such a common subject matter in Sufi rock music? That's a very good question. So Bulleh Shah is a very famous Sufi poet from northern India, I think, or Pakistan, like the northern Indian subcontinent, right? And there are a lot of Sufi music, as many of you might know, and a lot of Sufi music that employs sort of contemporary musical genres like rock. So there's this thing sometimes referred to as Sufi rock. And it seems that a lot of Sufi music, like contemporary Sufi music, employ the poetry of Bulleh Shah. Like, since you point this out, that must be the case, and I think I've noticed that too. That he seems to be a very popular poet in that regard. I think it's just a matter of region, right? That he is a very popular poet in a certain region, and that in that region, those kinds of musical expressions are common. In certain parts, so we listen to Qawwali music, for example, the poetry of Amir Khusro is, like, by far probably the most commonly employed. So I think it's just a matter of popularity and regional preferences. But I would love to look further into that subject, because that's very interesting. But that would be my guess. We have a fourth question from Ralph. He asked, do you know if there are any well-functioning human communities existing today that have survived for long periods without having an active organized religion within its community? If not, what could we learn? Can religion be replaced by something else or comparable, such as science, philosophy, or spirituality without religion? These questions are all dependent, and the answers to these questions are all dependent on how we define all of these terms. What does religion mean? What does spirituality mean? What is the difference between spirituality and religion? What's the difference between science and religion? Like, it becomes such a complicated topic, and you might mean one thing when you ask those questions, and I might mean something else when I read them or answer them. But so, as I said previously, I define religion primarily as a way of social cohesion and of identity formation. Defined as such, I don't think humans can live without religion. I think there is something inherent in us, that, so in our nature basically, that makes us crave that kind of belonging, and that we naturally create those kinds of structures around us that become what we call religions. You know, there might be an argument for the fact that we need to make sense of the world. The classic definition of religion by the scholar Clifford Geertz is basically that religion is a way of creating symbols that make sense of a chaotic world. So that's more of a sort of definition of religion that exists in a kind of psychological field, of like understanding religion as this way of us to create meaning in a seemingly meaningless world. I don't know if I don't necessarily follow that school of thought. I'm more in the sociological camp, but I think that also, the psychological aspect, should definitely be considered an aspect of it. I think they all kind of work together, and so I think there is something inherent in our humanity that just makes us form these kinds of structures and these ideas about the world in order for us to be able to function. So I don't know if there's any community that has existed without religion. At least if you define religion as broadly as I have, there's usually that kind of aspect to any community. I can't think of any that don't have that in history. Even in a secular world like today, we still have the same kind of structures. We just don't call it religion. We don't necessarily apply gods to it. But again, as we said, there are many religions that don't have gods. So what's the difference, right? So no, I think it's definitely a human, something about human nature that simply just needs religion. Whether so you also asked, like, if it can be replaced by science, or I don't think so. I think even the findings of science will allow us to form new structures around those findings or those truths that are expressed by science. Right? I think science as a method is something else, right? And religion is this other function of society that can, of course, mingle with science, and as science can be an aspect of that, or spirituality, or however you define and contrast these terms. I think they all can work together, but there's this need in human beings for this kind of expression, this kind of social cohesion in a way that, that's my stance at least. I am completely ready to be for counter arguments to that, but that seems to be where I land on these topics most of the time. Saptagadish Noshikunta asks, what do you think is the role of culture in religion? The same religion practiced in different geographical places take on the culture of the place in the day-to-day rituals and practices, so adherents belong to one religion but different cultures sometimes create diverse versions of the same religion. Definitely, I mean, culture, so the number one, I don't know if there's a difference between culture and religion, and I think dividing these two categories into distinct categories is a mistake, because I think they are in some ways the same thing, and you can't really separate them. This was the argument of the Palestinian scholar Talal Assad also, that we in the West, or in the modern world, we separate aspects of society like culture, religion, sports, science, etc. In ways that have never been the case historically before, for the most part at least. And that to do so is a mistake, or at least is a way of misunderstanding how these things work. They aren't separate categories. Culture and religion is the same thing, which is why, in some senses at least, it's the same thing. Which is why your next point is very much true. Like, of course, a religion that comes through a foreign environment will adapt aspects of that culture. So you look at a religion like Islam. Islam in Morocco looks very different from Islam in Indonesia. There is, of course, certain core features sometimes that are universal in both of those cases, but they, in some sense, they will look very, very different. And this is the case for most religions, unless it's like a really fundamentalist kind of a puritanical aspect of a certain religion. But even in those cases, that can't be escaped. So there's always this influence. Migration makes a huge difference, right? So people who migrate from the Middle East to the United States, those migrants in the United States will adopt aspects of the culture, the environment in the United States, which in turn will also affect how the people at home in the Middle East will also conceive of themselves and of their faith and their practice and so on. So it's a network. It's really a network of interconnected experiences, interconnected aspects that all play into the same, that all create the environment and the religion or culture that emerges or that is expressed. I think, I think culture and religion, as such, is sometimes the same thing, and at the very least are hugely interconnected and hugely influences each other in that sense. So yeah, I think you make a very good point in your question. Okay, second question from Septagirish. How do you separate the philosophy of religion from the practice of the religion? Every religion that exists philosophizes of a set of universal truths and beliefs in humanity and coexistence. Yeah. So the philosophy of religion versus the practice of a religion. This is a huge topic. So which comes first, the practice or the philosophy? The ritual or the rationalization of the ritual? Scholarship today tends to lean towards the latter, that it is the ritual, the practice that comes first. We are ritual creatures, we're performative creatures, we do things, and we rationalize and apply meaning to those rituals after the fact. So that the philosophy behind it is secondary. I think that's a legitimate position. This would really need like a whole series of videos. Actually, on my master's thesis, this was one of the main topics. One of the sort of main theoretical frameworks that I used was this idea of ritualization and how ritual practice is basically connected to religious belief and so on. I think it's a huge topic that has been written a lot about in the last couple of decades. One important, I think, aspect of this is, which I think figures into this, although it's not exactly what you're talking about here, but it's this idea of lived religion, which means that there is usually two facets of religion, you could say, at least in this context. So you have the religion as the ideal state of a religion, right, as conceived of as it by its scholars, by its great books, or in the universities or whatever, you have certain ideas about what religion is. But then on the grounds, how normal people actually live their religion can be very, very different. There is sometimes this dichotomy between the sort of I don't remember what term is used, but this basically, let's use the word ideal form of the religion, and then the lived religion. And the field of studying the actual lived religion has become a lot more prominent in the last couple of decades as well, that we shouldn't focus too much on the philosophies, as your question presumes, as in talking about like what does the religion teach, what is the stance of Islam on music or whatever it may be, but instead to actually study Muslims, like on normal people in their everyday lives, how they conceive of their religion, how they connect to religion, how they understand the religion, how they practice the religion, which is sometimes very different from those scholars or whatever. So that's a huge field. There's a book by Meredith McGuire called Lived Religion, which has become a huge classic in religious studies. So definitely you guys should check that book out if you're interested in this kind of topic. Farah is back and asks, what is your take and opinion on the connection between Abraham and Sarah and Brahma Saraswati as figures of Abrahamic and Hindu religions? I haven't heard of that connection before, actually. So I don't really know. I can't really comment on that. So there's a question, of course, whether or not Abraham and that whole story, are they historical figures or are they mythical figures? We don't know. I think scholarship tends to lean to the idea that they are mythical figures rather than historical ones. But I haven't, so that of course complicates the question. But I haven't heard this particular idea before about the connection to Hindu religion. It seems, just judging from the names, it seems like people may connect like the similarity in the names, like Abraham, Brahma. You have sort of, and Sarah and Saraswati, like the names are similar, and there are a lot of those kinds of linguistical similarities sometimes between Sanskrit or like Semitic languages. But at the end of the day, like they are completely separated language groups. Doesn't say that they can't have influenced each other, of course, but I think a lot of the time when I see those kinds of comparisons between words, it seems it's usually a bit far-fetched. So that's my sort of natural first reaction to this. It's like that seems a bit far-fetched, but I'm always open to any possibility. That would be an interesting thing to read more about, but I can't comment more on it than that. Noor Awareness asks, hi, I'm curious to know how Sufi culture evolved in Islamic culture. Islam being a strong belief system, and how can someone from an intense conservative organized religion culture think differently and become broad-minded and a free thinker? Sufism is based on love and compassion and is liberal in the sense that they are not interested in bullying anyone. You make a lot of assumptions in that question. For example, that Sufism is based on love and compassion or is liberal, and then implying thus that Islam isn't liberal and that it isn't based on love and compassion, and that Islam is based on, or Islam is at least interested in bullying people. You also seem to make the common mistake of separating Sufism from Islam in some sense, of saying like, how can Sufism appear in an Islamic environment, as if they are different things. Sufism is, so understand me correctly, Sufism is Islam. Right? Sufism is one expression of Islam. It's not that Sufism appears in spite of Islam, that Sufism appears in an Islamic environment and as this sort of anomaly. Sufism is a part of the intellectual and spiritual development of early Islam. That was one of the ways that the Muslims understood their religion, which and based that understanding firmly in the Quran and in the Hadiths. So I think there is an inherent problematic dichotomy in your question of posing Islam as a conservative, sort of strict belief system, and then having Sufism as something completely different. But they are intermingled. So Islam and Sufism is very much the same thing, even though some Muslims who don't believe so will say that Sufism has no part in Islam. And that's a theological belief that you can hold, but in terms of history and in terms of looking at things from a historical, critical, neutral perspective, right? Sufism is an expression and a part of the Islamic religion and the Islamic context more generally, right? And so if we have a Sufi who is liberal or emphasizes love and compassion, that means he's a Muslim who is liberal and emphasizes love and compassion. It's not that suddenly he is not a Muslim or that he is opposed to some kind of grand Islamic attitude. Instead, he is part of the Islamic attitude, right? Every Muslim is part of forming what Islam is, right? Islam, so there's this classic idea, which I discussed in a previous video, right? That Islam, so Muslims create Islam rather than Islam creating Muslims, right? So any Muslim is a representative of Islam in some sense. And so again, if Sufism is if Sufism is heavily concerned with love and compassion and charity and with all these kinds of ideas and teachings, which they are a lot of time, not always of course, but sometimes that is a huge emphasis within Sufi movements, then that means that that is also an aspect of Islam. It's not that that becomes some other thing, in opposition to Islam, that becomes one expression of Islam. Just like a more conservative, strict, puritanical, perhaps, expression of Islam is also Islam, right? Because religions are diverse, they are multifaceted, and there are many different people following that religion who approach it differently, but nonetheless they all represent that religion in some sense. So, yeah, I guess that's the best I can do in terms of an answer for that. Darjeeling Trailblazer, I love that name. I like your tease, Mr. Darjeeling. Based on your knowledge, would you regard the 5 books of Moses as a divinely inspired revision of previously existing Mesopotamian mythos? Okay, I had to take a break for a second because my batteries on my camera died. I also realized that I was so much in vacation mode that I didn't even bother to check my hair before recording. So now I've also kind of made myself a bit more respectable and representable, I guess, for this last question. The Israelites, the authors of the Hebrew Bible and the Torah, the 5 books of Moses in particular, figure in a cultural environment where they are neighbors with other cultures who have intellectual traditions of their own. They are neighbored by the Canaanites, by the Egyptians, by the Babylonians, the Persians. And all these people have traditions and stories and myths and all this that, of course, influence each other. These stories, they travel and they are told in various ways and they evolve and so on. And so it's hard to deny, you can't deny that there are stories and aspects of the Bible that are shared with other cultures in that region at that time, because the Israelites were one among those cultures and functioned in a similar way. So we have stories like the flood, for example, which seems to be very similar to stories from Babylonian literature, for example. So in many ways, yes, like the Bible, regardless of your stance on the Bible and its divine or not divine nature, there's no denying that the stories in the Bible is somehow connected also to other stories in cultures at around that time. Could be that those stories come originally from the biblical sources and that they spread to other places afterwards, or it could of course be the case that these are coincidences. But from a historical perspective, it seems definitely that the Israelites were influenced by other cultures and their intellectual and literary traditions in various ways. So that's going to have to be everything for this time. I hope I remembered to answer all of the questions by my patrons. This was a lot of fun. I'm having a great time here on a kind of vacation, as I said. So it'll be a bit slower in terms of releasing new videos now, but I'll be back pretty soon and I'll be making more videos. I have a few very exciting things planned for the near future. I did a poll on my Patreon page on what videos you would like to see next, and my patrons got the opportunity to vote. And the video that got the most votes was a video on Gnosticism. So a video, what is Gnosticism, will basically be the title. Now, that script is now finished. I have written that script and I'm very excited about that. However, that video will be part of a collaboration with another YouTube channel that you'll have to wait and see which one. And so there's a bit more work on that video that might or might not take a little longer. So I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be the next video because of these other factors. So I apologize if my poll was give you the wrong impression. That is the video of priority right now because you voted for that video, and that, as I said, the script is done. I am very much looking forward to doing that. But if that's not the next video, I'll be choosing the second most voted on video on the poll, which was a video on Dara Shukr, the great grandson of Akbar, the Emperor Akbar, which was my last video. So look forward to a video on Dara Shukr pretty soon. Look forward to a video on Gnosticism and a lot more fun stuff. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.